if I can, I want to.
If we can respond, I'm sure we have some time.
I'm going to throw out some
Yes.
reflections, and then perhaps we can sort of talk about them over at lunch. And I'll kind of go through them in history in order of what we spoke about. You talked about in this conversation around archives, and I think, obviously given my own nationality, I wanted to talk or think through statues as an archive.
Yes.
And what that
Monuments,
means.
statues and monuments.
Right.
Yes.
What that means for our understanding of
Yes.
archive. We've talked about a lot of sort of artifacts and material things that can perhaps be disinterred in some way from various sources. How do statues and monuments fit within that? And if possible, how can we talk about that in relation to Arab Islamic history in 7th century Arabia and idols, going back perhaps to Ibrahim alayhi salam's time, and the construction of idols in order to not forget God, and how that has sort of, where that then took society, Arab society. And so can we talk about that in relation to one another? Second, in our conversation about, what you're talking about, the technologies and selfies, I wonder how we can think about our individual representations of self in the context of the online spaces, and what that means for our understanding of history for a future generation, when we are very much aware of selfies being a false projection of reality in some ways. How do we fit that into an understanding of who we are for, as we said, and what we want perspectives to be about us in the future? And also what I thought was very striking about what you were saying was about language, and how our phrasing of different things or concepts and history is important. So, you said this idea of descendants of slaves, and what kind of imagery that brings to mind, and how we take ourselves to be, and we have this, always you see this conversation about enslaved peoples and slaves. And, you said, Fanon, and, I didn't even know Omar was a name attributed to him, was his middle name.
Most people don't.
But I thought that was interesting, because also when you look in the context of former President Obama, that Hussein was mostly admitted from his representations of his of when he was spoken about or written about. I'm going to try to run through this. This idea about queens and kings, I know this comes up a lot in Black culture, present day, and personally from friends, and where you said, we're all queens and kings, and often the refutation I hear is that, well, we have to balance the narrative.
Yes.
So I'm wondering perhaps if we can talk through what that means, and is that detrimental to our understanding of who we are or who we have been.
Can I just say before?
Yes.
The short answer is yes.
Yes, okay.
And you know why? And it works to our disadvantage.
Okay, yeah.
One of the way of illustrating that is something you've seen on British television over the years, where they make these television programs. What would happen if black people ruled Britain?
Yes.
All the white people were black and all the black people were white. There's been at least in the last 30, 40 years about 2 programs like that, fictional programs, okay? And the whole point is to say you would do the same as we are doing. And I'm suggesting no, we wouldn't do the same as we are doing. That's not how it works, okay? And it's a way of justifying that status quo, right? And we fall into that trap by reacting to it, saying, you, an eye for an eye. Well, people say sooner or later it's going to be blind, right? Okay, so an eye for an eye doesn't really work unless you have more than a few, you have a few spare eyes somewhere. Okay, it doesn't make sense. In the context that it comes out of, the biblical context, I understand what it's about. Reparations. right? So it's about people taking account for a crime. That's where it comes from in its reality context. But when you say an eye for an eye as a way of revenge, it's nonsense. It's never about revenge. It's about the criminal or the perpetrator being made to account, or what they call it, repair to the person, rather than sending them to jail. It's another way of justice, basically. Okay, it's not about revenge.
So I guess what my question would be to follow up from that, given that is sort of a meta-narrative that's circulating, and you saying that it's detrimental to our well-being, what are the alternate narratives and frameworks that perhaps, I often see this sort of this phrasing coming with parents and with their children and this sort of thing to try to connect them to history. What would you suggest then are different ways in which parents can begin to construct a past identity to connect their children to? Then moving further on, I thought this idea of what's the word for it? Globalized orientation and looking at culture. And the question I would put for us to discuss is, if we're saying culture is about how we are living in our everyday interactions to some extent, and the various ways in which we dress, eat, etc., are representations of that, as the world continues to become more globalized, and you have people in London living in very similar ways of people living in Nairobi, for instance. How do we then begin to understand culture that is nuanced in this sort of globalized world? And lastly, I'll say, I was at and I think this sort of was very much on point for our discussion, and even what you mentioned to me earlier when we were speaking, to Tuskegee College. I think this was maybe about 2010. Dr. Amina McLeod, she's a professor of African Studies in DePaul University in Chicago. And she was speaking, and she said to the group, she said, I review journal articles, encyclopedia entries, books, manuscripts, and I want to let you know that you're being written out of history. And when she said this, I got chills. It was so categorical, and she's someone who's in the position to say this because she knows what's going into print. So I think in reference to our conversation here, what does that mean for us and our contribution, and what part does everyone need to play in ensuring that doesn't happen?
Okay, good.
So
Wonderful.
I will end there, and perhaps,
I won't answer everything,
Yeah,
but
no
because
problem.
some of those things we'll pick up in the next session.
Yeah.
But what you said about the encyclopedia is very important. Wikipedia is written by humans. You know how Wikipedia happens? Anybody can write a Wikipedia entry.
Yes.
Anybody. Similarly, Encyclopedia Britannica and all the others are done by humans, scholars or non-scholars, and they decide what they want to put in as knowledge. Now, how does this knowledge become legitimate and authoritative becomes important, right? And of course, you will see professor of somewhere, another professor, 100 professors has contributed to this book. So, well, I better believe it then, okay? Nobody says they might be a little bit warped in the head. They might, be false premise for what they're talking, or their premise might be detrimental. It has achieved or authority. And again, it links to my discussion about Tuskegee. I don't know if people know about Tuskegee. Tuskegee Institute, the famous institutional learning started by Booker T. Washington in the 18th century to raise African Americans to a higher level of, academic and self-sufficiency. Of course, people thought he was backward. He's capitalist, he's, out of date, he's just creating black bourgeoisies, etc. Now we have I would venture to say, a crisis with education in African America, as it is everywhere. Because what they then go to is Harvard, MIT, etc., etc. And who is teaching them? Anybody see anybody with a master's in business studies? What do they call MBA? Just run in the opposite direction. It's the biggest waste of time. They all run in Africa now, which is why it's in such a mess. American degrees based on formulas designed to make American business triumph. That's what an MBA is. Okay? They are systems of thinking and running business management. So black people in Africa, wherever, are not producing the scholars and the experts that they need. They are producing the scholars that America needs. So when they have a problem in Africa, they think about, what did my professor tell me?
I think what illustrates that point the most is in Oxford.
I'm sorry, Tuskegee today has very little prestige, as you were saying to me. And it's an agricultural college. The root of it is around agriculture and engineering, basically. And crazy.
Yeah, what I was going to say to your point was that in Oxford, the African Studies department, the master's program there, they're run. There aren't any black professors.
No.
The irony is that the cohort predominantly come from the continent.
Yeah. Of course.
So it's this very warped way in which
white people are teaching Africans about African history.
So it's very interesting.
This country.
You same thing in the British Museum. The British Museum, British Library, producing amazing stuff, and it's all produced by white experts. And it's not being taught even in Africa. Even that stuff is not being taught. So we have this problem about the perception, the whole idea of the warping of knowledge. Okay?
It seems to imply that we have to, it's almost as though we need to remain to recognize that we're in a state, we're constantly in flux. Because the past is continuously being rewritten by, the arrival of more information, different archives, different understanding, and I think that also, this idea of history being something that's permanent, and even our desire to find, as you were saying, this purity, the source, the right account, is perhaps not the best way to look at it. Even as you were saying with Google, they have removed Palestine from their maps.
Yes.
Yes. So if that's our, as an example, if that's our sort of source,
if you want to
then
do
you're
politics
rewriting
of maps,
the
just
spatial,
look at the Palestinian situation, you see the politics of maps. Alright?
Going on, sorry.
Okay. So hopefully at the end of the day, we will pull up, but you've mentioned keep those notes, because some of those I might touch on in the next presentation, but by the third one, we can pull them together about how we work things forward.